Up until now, to check if your code works, you've had to temporarily set up console.log statements and run the code over and over. It's time-consuming, tedious, and prone to human error. Unit testing automates this process. You write short, isolated script files. They test one tiny unit of code, like a single function or a class method, and they make it possible to do that as many times as you need to without having to rewrite temporary code that may or may not check everything you need to. For JavaScript, we use an industry-standard testing framework called Jest. Jest acts like an automated quality inspector. It runs your code behind the scenes, passes in test values, and uses special methods called matchers to verify if the actual output matches your expected results. The first thing you need to do is to make sure that Jest is available to your code by installing it with npm. In this case, I've already done it. I used the command npm install Jest at the directory level of my O3 unit testing folder because I didn't want to install it for my entire code base here. I wanted it just for these sections. So you see here that it added it as a dependency, and then I also added a couple of configurations. This configuration has it ignoring any paths that have my solution files so that when I run it for my demos and you run it for your exercises, it won't cause confusion. The other thing I did was to add a quick way for us to run tests from the command line. So how do you write a test? Let's take a look. First of all, we know that we need to export anything we want to test so that it's available to our testing file. The convention is to create a test directory right next to the files you want to test, and then to create a test file for each one of those that shares their name, except you see .test right in front of the .js. This file is where we write our Jest tests. We make sure that we import the items we want to test so that we can run them, and then we set up test blocks themselves. Now, right now, if I were to try to run this, I could go over here to partyutils.test.js, right-click on it, and see Run Jest on Path. And you'll notice that it gives us this very complicated command here with long paths, but it ultimately leads to just this file. It tests it, and it tells us that the entire file passed with 2 to-dos. So essentially that means here, it recognizes that we have tests we plan to write, but it doesn't have any real content yet for it to test. So technically, nothing is truly passing because we don't actually have the test written, but it also is not failing, and that prevents confusion. So this is a good way for you to set things up and have placeholders for yourself when you're planning out all of your tests, to just use test.todo and pass in the description of the test. But when you're ready to write the test, you need to take the .todo off and actually call the test method. And the first argument that you pass in is the description, but it actually takes a second argument. So I'm going to use a comma here and then start an anonymous function. The reason you pass in an anonymous function is because Jest is going to be running these tests one at a time, and you want to define the code within that block that it should eventually run when it's ready to, but you don't want to try to call it right away. So we'll define our test inside this block, and it will be run along with this description. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to set this up just to make sure you understand the syntax. The first is to separately declare what we actually have going on with our code. So I'll call it actual. And this is where we go to the function we want to test, call it, pass in some arguments, and then when that return value comes, it gets stored as actual. Then I'll also create expected and just say 27. So this is usually a hard-coded value of some kind that you're just comparing against what you think this is going to return. Now we make our assertion, because so far we haven't actually put anything in here that Jest can run. The assertion starts with expect and allows us to pass in the actual value, then call a matcher. In this case, I'm going to choose toBe. It's a great matcher to use when you just have primitives like numbers. And we'll say expected. So we expect the actual to be the same as expected. Let's go ahead and run this. I can right-click on here, say Run Just on Path. And we see one passed, one to do, and one pass. So we definitely have a test with a true assertion in it passing now. And we can also see that here because the one with that particular description has the green check mark by it now instead of the indication that it hasn't been written yet. So let's do one more assertion here that's testing the same thing, but I want to show you what it looks like to do it all in one line. We can say expect, and then I'll just call calculate combined power again and pass in some new values. And then after the parentheses from the expect call, that's when I say .toBe, and then I pass in the value I expect, which is 50. So for very short, simple assertions, it's pretty typical to just do it like this, but I wanted to do it this way where I broke it down just so you understood what these represent. Let's go ahead and run this again, and this time I'm going to show you how to do this from the command line. I can just run npm test from my 03 unit testing directory here because I know that Jest is installed in this section. And you'll notice we get a bunch of files from other demos and exercises that we're not looking at right now. And that's because I was not very specific. I just said npm test, and because I configured it in package.json, it just went and found any Jest files that it could and tested them all. But if you don't want to do that, you can be more specific. I could say npm test, and then I could pass in the specific name, party utils.test.js, and it will go look just for that file. Notice I'm not even in the right directory for that, but it still knows to go look for it because I was being more specific. So that gives you some flexibility to test specific files without having to change directories all the time. Okay, so let's move on. I've already taken care of all of these demos. I'm just going to get them out of the way. We have a second one here that says test.todo get starter spells returns the correct initial magic array layout. So this is referring to our other function that we want to test that is returning an array with 2 strings in it. So this will be very straightforward because this is essentially saying we are just looking for those hard-coded values to be returned. So I need to transform this. Instead of being a to-do now, it's going to be an actual test. After the description, I will pass in my anonymous function, and then we'll take these one at a time. I'm going to call the function to be tested by storing it in a const. I'll just call it spellbook and say get starter spells. Okay, so that should return that array, store it in here, and now we can test. I'll say expect spellbook, which is the result from our actual code, toBe, and then pass in a hard-coded array saying fireball and heal shield. Okay, now I know this is going to fail, and you may not know why, but let's just run it anyway. So we see that it expected fireball and heal shield, and it says it serializes to the same string. But here it shows you object.isEquality. If it should pass with a deep equality, replace toBe with toStrictEqual. Now we can do that, but it turns out that toEqual will do the same thing. I'm going to actually copy this. We're going to do this 2 different ways. I'm going to show you that if we continued to use toBe, we could say not toBe. And then for the positive side, we could say toEqual. Now let's try this, and this entire thing should now pass. There we go. So this one is now passing. Get starter spells returns the correct initial magic array layout. And it's passing on both counts, not to be equal in memory, but to be equal on a deep basis where it's just comparing the actual elements inside the arrays. I want to talk about one more matcher, and we're just going to bundle it in with this same test. What if we wanted to check to see if the array contained a specific value? We could say expect spellbook toContain, and then just give it the string fireball. Now let's run it again. And we pass again. So all three of those assertions returned true, and so the entire test passed. Now there's a third way that you can run tests, and that's to use an extension called Jest Runner. So if you come over here to extensions and you look up the Jest vtest runner, you make sure that it's installed and enabled here, and then it should be available within your files. And it looks like this, these little green play buttons over here next to each test. As soon as it picks up on the fact that you're defining a test, it adds this so that you can run it right from here. And I can run these on an individual basis. So I can run just this one, and it says that it skipped the other one. And then vice versa. I can run one and skip the other one. And you'll notice that instead of coming up in the terminal, it actually came up in this test results panel instead, which is nice because it's isolated from whatever you're doing in the terminal. If you do not see the green symbols here, then you may need to go to your settings, go to the JSON settings for this, and just go down and make sure you don't already have it in here. But you'll notice I have a couple of configurations here for Jest Runner in my general settings for VS Code. One is to make sure that the Test Explorer is enabled, and the other is to make sure that ES modules are allowed, because Jest was originally meant to run in common JS modules. So just make sure that you have the correct configuration here for your VS Code and whether you're using ES modules or common JS modules, and you should have no trouble running the tests right here in the file. Okay, you do have a practice exercise here where you've got a couple of different files, Armory and MP Engine, and you'll notice that I've created test files for each of these separately, but they correspond as you would expect them to. And all you need to come in here is transform them from a to-do to an actual test, and then set everything up and use the correct matchers, and you can make sure that the code is working as it's expected to for each of these. That's all I've got. I will see you in the next one.